second point is I would make is though the US is nothing like as unipolar as it thought it was, the world is nothing like as unipolar as it thought it was, there is still, the US is still today, despite what everybody says, the most powerful single player by a long way, though clearly diminished from where it was some years ago. And I do believe that the rest of the world is looking to the US to provide leadership because there isn't another leader. There just isn't. And will coalesce around it if it's reasonably sensible in what it proposes and pushes it reasonably hard. So I think there is some possibility of running this world now effectively. 10 years from now, if everything proceeds as we now expect, 15 years from now, it will start looking very bipolar. China's going to be very, very big. And how that will start looking, as India gets bigger, it will start looking tripolar. How that world will look, I don't know. I have thought a lot about this, the relations between China and the US in the long run, and I have no real sense of how that will play out, because they're two very different civilizations, obviously. I tend to the view, I used to tend to the view, I'm less sure of that they had, both of these countries had one thing in common. Basically, at bottom, they were quite pragmatic. You know, basically, they were on massive ideological crusades to transform the world. I'm not so sure about this anymore for the US, so we'll have to see. But I'm not completely, I don't think it's impossible to imagine you could make this a reasonably stable bipolar world. But we'll see. At the moment, however, it isn't really bipolar. China's much weaker than the United States and much more vulnerable, and they know it. They really do know it. Otherwise, why the hell would they have bought $2 trillion of US dollar liabilities? This isn't a source of strength, it's a source of weakness. The US, as I have pointed out in my book, could sequester the whole lot and default on it overnight in a conflict situation. Very unattractive. On the greening of America, the greening of the world, I tend to think it's a help. I don't see why it shouldn't be if you pursue, one of the encouraging things in the budget is there is the announcement essentially that the US is going to a cap and trade system. We'll have to see whether that works, whether it happens. I think it's going to be part of the solution to revenue problems. You know, the US can't tax gasoline. Well, it can tax carbon. It's just as good. And the US is certainly going to need revenue. The budget statistics are quite something. In the long run. And I think that we need a large world investment program of some kind to absorb all these excess savings. Instead of putting them into houses nobody needs, we could actually build useful infrastructure, and part of it will be new power grids and power structures. So I actually don't see why it shouldn't be a useful part of the medium to long run recovery for this mess. If people want to save more than they can use at home, at least put it into infrastructure, put it into investment. Don't consume it.
Questions here? Any students? Thinkler, we want to come back to you because you'll be called on. Jack.
Ever since
just identify yourself.
Oh, my name is Jack Kalaman, and I'm a stockbroker. Ever since Obama has been elected, the N-word has been haunting him. How would you counsel him to deal with the nationalization question?
Yes, I've been thinking of writing a column about this for next Wednesday because I think it's the way it's presented is a complete non-issue. I just don't understand what this is all about. Let me put it in two ways. First, what is the real question? The real question is who bears the losses. It's quite simple. In my view, there are very large losses which have reduced almost certainly, but we don't know. We'll see about the famous stress testing. The value of a number of major financial institutions of assets below their liabilities. So they are massively capital short, right? And that will be true even if they were roughly. So we've got to get additional capital into these institutions. And the question is, which have very uncertain balance sheets on the asset side. The question is, how do you do that? In essence, in the present circumstances, because of the uncertainty, I can't go more. There are essentially only two sources of this capital. One is the public sector, so it invests a large amount in the process, ineluctably, it becomes the majority owner, which is where it's going. And the second possibility, which is the standard route, is bankruptcy. And what most people talk about when they talk about nationalization, I think they actually mean bankruptcy. They mean what the FDIC would normally do. You take an institution, you write down the value of the junior debt, the preferred, the subordinated, they lose a hell of a lot of money. They're then the owners of the institution. You've got your capital. End of story. The real issue here is they don't want to do that. Because the people who own this stuff really don't want to be liquidated. Well, that's quite understandable, but it's bankruptcy. And the funny thing is, that's what most people mean by quote-unquote nationalization. You take over the institution, restructure the assets, and so forth. But in the end, the question is where the capital comes from. Now, and I tend to be very sympathetic to the latter solution, the bankruptcy restructuring solution. If the government doesn't go that route and decides essentially to do what it's now doing, put in more and more capital into these institutions, it is the dominant supplier of risk capital to the institutions, which they are now. I don't care what you call it, it's nationalized. If you're running Citibank today, who is your most important shareholder? The government. Who else do you care about? They're the only people who are supplying capital to you, so of course you have to pay attention to what the government thinks. And the idea that in this situation the government can say, well, we are the dominant investor, but you go and run the institution any way you please. It's absurd. You can't possibly do it. So instead of just doing it outright, making the decision, we are playing games and pretending that what is in fact a nationalization process isn't one. Now, a combination which you've got the private decision-making in the institution and the government is bearing all the risk, is not tenable. So they have to decide in the end what the solution is. My solution is, my view is, you restructure the institution through a bankruptcy process, as I described. Finally, even if you did put in lots of public capital, clearly the aim, of course, is to reprivatize as soon as possible. Once you've cleaned up the balance sheets, which is obviously the aim, take out the toxic assets and don't worry about this horrible process of trying to create a market in toxic assets, which I think is unworkable. Just take them out, put them in a separate bank. You've then got a clean bank. You can sell it back to the market because everybody then knows what the balance sheet is worth. So I think nationalization is a complete red herring, and I don't understand how it's got into this debate at all.
Then we're going to take an iPod of this, what you just commented, and send it to Paul Krugman. So he can, the New York Times columnist and economist who has been beating the drum for nationalization in that word, quote unquote.
Pre-privatization is what we call it.
Okay. Right here. Please identify yourself.
My name is Fletcher Hodges. I'm an investment manager, and I helped to set up some of the equity and securities markets in Eastern Europe. My question is not strictly macroeconomic, but it does turn on the question as to who is responsible for the mess. And I read your column regularly and some other things in the Financial Times, and I'm surprised more interest hasn't been fastened on the question of how these boards, these bank boards, have been involved in this whole proposition. And as I look at these boards, these bank boards, what I see are a lot of prominent names, people who have accomplished a great deal in their own fields, but very few of them know anything about banking. And I'm wondering whether you feel that as part of the reform of this whole mess, we ought not to professionalize the bank board. We require Merrill Lynch brokers to take certain tests as a basic guarantee that they know what they're doing. How about bank boards? What can be done to turn these into more professional institutions?
Well, I agree.